Okay, everybody, welcome to your lecture today. We will be learning about power, different concepts and ideas related to this very big topic of power in our society. And we are applying these concepts to understand violence in Myanmar, not just direct violence that we can see, but some of the indirect form of violence which exists in our politics, in our social relations, and is a subject of a lot of the activism and scholarship and work that people are doing to try to change the country for many years. My name is Stephen Gray. I'm the director of an international NGO called Adapt Peacebuilding. We started working in Myanmar in 2015. I myself have been working in the country since 2008, and we're living in Yangon and traveling all around the country between 2012 and 2018. My work has historically involved working on the peace process before 2021 with EROs, with civil society organizations, with political parties, with international donors. And also with Adapt Peacebuilding, we set up these participatory action research projects on peace-related issues, development, humanitarian issues in northern Myanmar and Kachin and Shan states. I'm also a doctoral researcher at the Institute of Development Studies in the United Kingdom at the University of Sussex, and my research is comparing the post-coup environment and the pre-coup peace process from the perspective of how these change processes are able to integrate the different concerns of people and groups at different levels of society. So it's looking at power relations and how power actually shapes who gets to participate and in what ways in relation to trying to create the kind of future that people are looking for. In many ways, what we will talk about today is really at the heart of the way that I've practically been working with different people and organizations in the country, as well as my academic work. So it's my pleasure to be speaking with you about this. Today, we will have some concepts. I'm also going to share some readings with you. I'm going to ask you some questions. And I'm really excited at the opportunity to speak with you in a week's time. And I want you to come prepared, having done your homework like good students, and also read the readings and ready to ask me some specific questions and have a conversation that brings your own experience to the conversation, because it's absolutely critical that you relate what we're learning about power to your own work and your own experience. So without further ado, let's get into it. So power is a very big topic. It's a word that many of us use in different ways. In English, it has very broad meaning. So we need a lot of different concepts to describe it and to approach it from different directions. And these concepts, they help us to understand a definition for power. They help us to understand its sources, where it comes from, what different types of power there are, some that are visible and easy to see, some that are hidden and invisible, how it is exercised or expressed in relationships between people and groups. This one's really important. And at different spaces or levels in our society where we can observe it. I think what we often find with power is that people have an understanding of power which is mostly about leaders. It's mostly about what we can directly see, like politics or the use of violence, but we're less familiar with power in its more subtle forms, about how it is learned, about our own identities, what we have internalized, and how that shapes our society, how that shapes the options that are available to different kinds of people, the agency that they have to act in the world in accordance with the interests that they have. Now, the first part of this lecture looks at those concepts of power using examples from Burma, Myanmar. And the second half of the lecture looks at a specific case, which is how power is exercised as power over in violence, which is both direct violence like military force, etc., as well as what is called structural and cultural violence, because this is a pathology, this is a challenge in Burma of a violent society in different ways that people are working to address through the resistance, through activism, through scholarship, through civil society. It is not just something that is about a peace process. It is a much longer term change that we are looking at, and it helps us to understand this relationship between violence and power. So let's get started. So a quick summary of how ideas of power have evolved over time. Power theory and ideas used to focus on relatively visible forms of decision-making. So thinking about politics, thinking about the use of force, coercive action, how a person, a group would get others to do what they wanted, how outcomes were controlled. This is known as the first phase of power. What we have seen over time is that these more visible and obvious ways of understanding power have been added to with less obvious, less visible ways in which power operates in our society. So the second form of power is before decisions even get made politically, before we can influence outcomes, who controls and how is it controlled? What issues are even on the agenda? So the second phase of power is about setting the agenda, and we're going to see examples of how cronies, business interests, international actors, civil society groups try to influence the agenda. The third phase of power, moving into the early 2000s, is about how thoughts and beliefs get controlled, how propaganda works, how ideology works, to even shape what kind of issues people would want to get onto the agenda. So the point that I want to make here is that the conception of power and the factors that influence power have expanded over time, and they've become more and more subtle and less visible. And that's really critical for our lecture today, because I want to focus in on things like our identities, our own identities as women, men, as different ethnicities, different ages, how these less visible forms shape what we understand about ourselves and what we are capable of, how they shape our agency. Now, the definition of power that we will use today is even more expansive than that, and it comes primarily through the work of Foucault in the 1970s and 1980s. And that is a conception of power which is not just about thinking about leaders who have a lot of power, but thinking about power as being everywhere. Power as being something that is created through knowledge, and how knowledge controls the power that people have, that it constitutes our social relationships. So how we relate to each other, our parents, brothers and sisters, different ethnic groups, leaders, different parts of our society, those relationships all have a power dynamic, and it actually creates who we are in the world. It creates subjects. So it's not like Minang Rang, the commander-in-chief, is the most powerful person. It's that the whole society, the whole institutions around the Tatmadaw, around how that institution has developed over time, its ideology, that creates a subject and controls what he can do in the world. Now, we don't need to understand those definitions completely, although there's some readings there to help you to do that. The key thing that I want you to understand from this fourth face of power, that it is a very rich and diverse range of factors that interact to influence the agency that any one person or organization has in the world. So this is a critical distinction I want you to understand between so-called power and so-called agency. So power being a multitude of force relations that influence what a person or organization has agency to do in the world. And so Hayward's definition here is really useful for us. Power as a network of social boundaries that delimit for all what is socially possible. It facilitates and constrains social action. And for us as scholars, for activists, for practitioners, we're interested in how we act in ways that can change those social boundaries. From my perspective, that's in the pursuit of more just and peaceful societies. Okay, so where does power come from? Sources of power. Now, often when we think of powerful people, power holders, we think of their access to resources. So we think of how wealthy they are. We might think of cronies as being powerful, as the military being powerful because they have access to assets of different types, hardware of different types, companies, land, and you have the haves and the have-nots from that perspective. And that's, if we wanted to deconstruct or unpack this view of power, we could use Marxist theory, for example, which looks at who controls the means of production and how the bourgeoisie or the proletariat, bourgeoisie controls, proletariat is excluded from control over the means of production, and it creates unequal social relations. If you took a more feminist approach of understanding the sources of power, you might look at human bodies. So who controls what bodies human bodies are able to be used for? So are women able to choose whether they bear children or whether they are able to work in the labor force and have access to planned parenthood, family planning? This is a concern or a question in a range of societies. In the United States last year, the right for women to be able to access abortion, for example, was rolled back by the Supreme Court. So women, from that perspective, don't have the right, as much control as they used to over their own bodies. But also applies to labor. So who is able to work in different professions? What are they able to do? In the caste system in India, for example, it is highly hierarchical. So if you're from the lower castes, you're expected to do certain forms of labor, hard physical labor, work that requires you to do things that are seen as unclean, and you don't have the opportunity to work in different professions. Another way to understand it is around knowledge. Who gets to access different forms of knowledge? Are you able to learn in your own language? Are you disadvantaged because you have to learn in a language which is not your mother tongue? Is everybody able to go to secondary education, to tertiary education? This has an impact on power, because the more that you learn, the more you're able to acquire skills and knowledge that can improve your circumstances, that can give you access to different types of work, different economic prospects. So that's a third source of power. And the final source is called, in your reading, intangible sources, but I prefer to call it network sources. And this relates to your social relationships. So it's not necessarily the financial resources that you get from your social relationships, your family, your clan, your business network, but it might be solidarity, mutual support, like a psychological support mechanism. It might be access to knowledge. It might be access to opportunities. These are increasingly important, or quite important, when we think about changing unjust, violent social relationships, because we might draw upon and look to maximize the collective power of networks of people and organizations. So whenever you see this little pause button down the bottom here, I invite you to pause this recording for a moment and consider how this relates to your own life. So what I'd like you to do now is pause and think about, in relation to these 4 categories, in your own life, in your own family, and in your own network. Think about the sources of power that you have available to you, and try to really unpack that in as much detail as you can, and think about what you don't have access to. For all of these questions, pauses, there'll be 3 or 4 of them in this lecture. Develop some questions or comments that you could then bring into the conversation that we will have in a week's time. So feel free to pause now. Okay. So congratulations, we're moving on to our second topic already, and we're going from sources of power, where it comes from, to forms of power. So you might say that's different types of power. And remember, I described that, there's been this evolution of understanding from the visible to the less visible over time. So these different types of power are going to pick up on some of that progression. And the first one is called visible power. So the way that we see visible power acting out is that it's in the public space, where we can experience it or observe it. So often this is political processes, particularly if we're interested in governance, or we're living in a democratic type of state. It's not just at the top elite level of politics. It might be in chambers of commerce. It might be in civil society networks, but it concerns decision making, and it concerns policies or laws which are visible, and decision making that is happening in accordance with those laws. It might be referring to the exercise of laws nationally or subnationally, and the degree to which those laws and policies are getting followed. So from this perspective and this type of power, it's clear who is exercising that power, who is making the decisions. And if we're trying to change it, a visible power, we're trying to change laws and policies. We're trying to change decision making. And that's what a lot of our politics are predicated upon, is that there is a visible and honest mechanism which, through voting, through lobbying, we can actually change the decisions that are being made and try to advance our interests in that way. Now, the issue with seeing only power of this type is that there's actually a lot that happens behind the scenes which is not visible. So there are actors that are influencing what kind of decisions can be made, what kind of issues even get onto the agenda. And when that agenda is enacted through laws and policies, there are actors that are manipulating how those laws and policies or decisions are enacted. So it actually just matches their interests. And this is very common in Myanmar. So the military has been behind the scenes pulling the strings for a long time, not always completely behind the scenes, right? Because in the Constitution, they were formally written into that in an invisible way, but through like the economic holdings companies, through relationships with cronies, through the different ways that laws would be used. For example, the telecommunications laws or committee structures that would be stacked with people that were exercising, pulling the strings behind the scenes. There's actually many ways that issues are kept off the agenda, or that the concerns of some parts of the society don't get responded to because the military and cronies and other actors are exercising other forms of power, other types of power. So what is those other types of power? Well, hidden power is what it's called. So hidden power is less easy to see, as the name suggests. It doesn't show up in official documents. The decisions that are getting taken are not available for public scrutiny. But those actors that are trying to use that form of power are aware that they are doing it, even if it's not public. So often vested interests, whether those interests are broadly for the public good or against the public good, they are hidden from the public sphere. So the example that I give here relates to the jade industry in Burma, which at the time of writing of this report in 2015 by Global Witness in collaboration with Kachin-based civil society organizations and researchers. At that time, the industry was calculated to be worth $32 billion. I don't know what it is now. I don't know if you have access to that data. But I think about 1 billion of that, if less, was actually going through the public treasury. So this revenue, which the large majority of it was going to members of the Tatmadaw, that was not going into public budgets, whether at a national level or at a state level. So there's a hidden power, which is not wanting to have responsible natural resource management, not wanting to have budget oversight of revenues in jade or public taxation of revenues. And it's wanting to maintain an economic benefit for a relatively small number of people and some institutions, both on the Tatmadaw side and on the non-state actor side in the case of the KIO. Wanting to keep those from the out of the public sphere. And that's a problem because it's not in the interests of most people. It causes a lot of environmental damage. It doesn't allow for the responsible development of social services that might benefit people, for example. So that's a kind of hidden power that's coming from the business community, from the military industrial complex. But hidden power might come from civil society as well, both positive and so-called uncivil society, negative aspects of civil society, like those religious leaders, which might foster hate speech, for example. It might come from other types of actors. But what this does is it excludes a lot of the concerns of society from being addressed in public decision-making, and it biases certain people and issues. Now, to give another example, which is of hidden power, which is, I won't use the word positive because you decide for yourself what's positive and what's negative, but that it's coming from a different set of concerns. So this example is about resistance, and resistance to to a form of oppressive power, which in this case, I'm talking about Pachasan, which some of you might know or recall has been a civil society movement in Kachin state, primarily to respond to the epidemic of drug abuse that has for generations been impacting many ethnic young people of all types, but it has been better or worse in different parts of the country. Now, when I was living in Myanmar still, the government response and the international community's response on the drug issue was for many far too small and ineffective with this compared to the scale of this problem. So, led by faith-based organizations and other civil society groups, Pachasan would go out and eradicate crops, illicit drug cultivation, would arrest people that were involved in the drug trade and put them in prison. And this is a form of resistance because it goes against what the governing authorities and power holders in the country were doing or wanting to be done in relation to this problem. Now, resistance is also an extremely important part of the change process in the post-coup environment. So a lot of the activism that is underway, the civil disobedience movement, People's Defense Forces, although they're a little bit different because they're more of a using violence more than being a non-violent movement. But these are forms of resistance. So they're resisting an illegitimate takeover of power by the Burmese military. And that form of hidden power, there's reasons to keep it hidden because it's dangerous for that to be too visible. So I just make the point to say that hidden forms of power, they're conscious strategies of those that use it, but they're not visible in the public space. Okay, the third and final type of power that I will present is even more subtle than visible or hidden power. It's called invisible power. And the difference is that invisible power is unconscious. We don't even know that we're being impacted by it. And that's what makes it so powerful. That's what makes it so pervasive, because what people feel like they can do in the world, how they can act, and the change that they can create is a product of what they have internalized their whole lives that relates to who they are, how they see themselves, and how they see themselves in relationship to others. And because we are not conscious of it, it controls us. I think this one is critical in Myanmar. So this is, as I said, how invisible power is a power to shape the way that people think and feel about themselves. So that's when it is being exercised over people, right? When you're experiencing it yourself, it's like it is in this cartoon. It's this person building the pyramids, dragging along a huge block by themselves, thinking, thank goodness I've got this job because it's all that I'm good for. Now, that belief that that's all that they're good for came from somewhere, and it's limiting what actions they will take in the world. So invisible power, as we will see, it can be a product of how we are raised in our homes. It can be a product of how we relate to organizations and institutions. So what we learn through the education system, what we learn in the church or from the Sangha, or our in our Islamic faith or whatever faith we might have. It might be a product of the propaganda mechanism of the state and the information environment that is getting promoted, or it might be a product of what the international community, human rights norms, international development agendas. It's probably a product of all of these things, right? But it's going to affect different people differently. We'll dig into a little bit more how this relates to ideas of ethnic superiority or chauvinism, how this links to patriarchy, how this links to ageism. And that really is my question for you. So, two parts to this question. First, can you think about in your life how invisible power might manifest? What are the features of that? So you might think about how that relates to ethnicity in Myanmar or nationhood, how it relates to gender relations, how it relates to age, how it relates to religious identity, and anything else you can think of, and what might people be internalizing that that defines what they think that they are capable of relative to others. Can also include social class, education level, and other factors. That's the first part of it. The second part of it, how is it maintained? What are the institutions that are promoting that kind of invisible power? So you can pause now and have a go at those. Okay, I told you I'd give you an example. So patriarchy is a feature of many societies. Patriarchy is a form of invisible power. It's a common ideology in many countries that says, if not directly, then indirectly, that males are superior. And it isn't just a system that is enforced by men, but a system that maintains over time, because what women internalize often through their upbringing in the home and school and in broader society, that internalizes this ideas that they are not capable of doing particular things. Why does it matter? Well, it's half of the population, if not more, that is not able to fulfill their broadest aspirations and their greatest potential because a set of limiting beliefs that are being perpetuated in that society. It's not necessarily to say that men and women are exactly the same in every way, but that there should be equality of opportunity, and that all people should feel empowered and able to live to their fullest potential. So that is the idea of patriarchy. And in this cartoon, it's making fun of patriarchy in two ways, because it's saying, son, you throw like a girl. So there's an assumption there that throwing like a girl is worse, weaker. And it says, because you are raised in a patriarchal society that discourages women from participating in sports. So would women throw like girls if they were not brought up in a society that discouraged them from doing that? That's the idea. As with all of these ideas, if you're really interested in particular parts of this, there's links there where you can go and read more. Okay, so we have, so far with power, we have looked at where it comes from, how we define it, and we've looked at the different types, visible, hidden, and invisible. These are critical ideas. The third set of ideas that I want to introduce is how power is expressed, how power is exercised. So not what type it is, but how it's actually used, the direction in which it is used. And I want to do this by looking in a particular case or a particular domain of our social life, which concerns relationships between people and the enactment of violence in those relationships. I'm going to argue through the presentation of concepts, theories of others, that violence is not just in a direct form through military violence, torture, killing, homicide, gender-based violence, but that it's structural, it's cultural, and it can be oppressive, and it can limit and even lead to the deaths of people, even when it's not a direct or personal form. And that all of this is linked to an unjust patterns of power relations in our society, which can be transformed depending on the nature of our action. So let's get into it. So if we want to understand how power is expressed, how it is exercised between people, we can talk about it in a number of different ways. I'm going to start by talking about power over and power under. So remember, when I'm talking about how power is expressed, how power is exercised, we're mostly talking about how it is used between individual people or between groups of people. Okay, so power over, and apologies if the translations are not exactly right because the text has been updated. But typically power over is seen as a bad way of exercising power that we should try and change as scholars, activists, civil society, people involved in resistance. So it's often associated with people or organizations that seek to dominate others, that seek to coerce or control others to make them do what they want. Sometimes that coercion is direct insofar as it is using violence or the threat of violence to compel others to do something. But it's not always bad. It can go in the other direction, so to speak. So when you're voting, it's a non-coercive form of power over. You are exercising as a citizen your democratic right to put into power a political party or a person that is serving the interests that you believe to be most possible. So it's not coercive. You're not forcing or controlling political leaders to do what you want, but you are taking non-coercive action to try to have some power over them. And in a healthy democracy, there's a strong social contract between citizens and state. So the state is not supposed to have complete power over its citizens, but there's supposed to be a reciprocal relationship in which they serve only at the invitation of the citizens through the electoral process. So there's a balance of power here. But most often power over it is seen in this negative sense, which is where some groups are dominating others, often through some form of violence. And this is where I want to introduce an idea or set of ideas which link to power and link in really important ways if we want to understand how we go about changing unequal power relations in our society that impact on the agency or the ability of most people to live the kind of lives that they want. So I'm going to introduce some ideas from Johan Galtung, who was the so-called father of peace and conflict studies, writing between the late 60s and up until the 1990s or 2000s on the ideas of violence and power. So you can understand violence as a form of power over, where people or whole systems are exercising power in a way that is violent insofar as it impacts upon the ability of citizens of different types to live the kind of lives that they want. So just to break that down a bit more fully for you, the most obvious type of violence that we are all familiar with is called direct violence or personal violence. And it's really visible. That's why it's above this dotted line, like this was an iceberg, right? With the part above the water and then the parts below. But direct violence, we have all seen. Some of us have experienced. It might be assaults, killing, torture, or gender-based violence. It's personalized, like it's acted out by a person against another person. There's a perpetrator, a clear one who's doing it. And it has the direct consequence, but it also has a psychological consequence. It causes trauma. It intimidates people. And so, I remember interviewing someone a couple of years ago in Machina, where they talked about how their father was imprisoned for 4 or 5 years during the 1990s. And then they talked about when they were young in the 90s and 2000s, having to work as doing forced portering to carry supplies for the Burmese army. And they talked about now, and that was 2021 or 22, their fear of being imprisoned, of being tortured because of their civil society role, of having to stop at checkpoints and show their ID cards, etc. That violence hung over that person for years and years and is incredibly intimidating. And from a power agency perspective, it stops you from doing what you could otherwise do in the world, to act accordance with your interests. So it coerces people to keep small and to limit their range of action. Remember that network of social boundaries that exist because of power. That's how direct violence can act. And if you look at a peace process, or a ceasefire, it's trying to address that direct violence, and many other types of mechanisms are as well. Structural violence is a category of violence that is less visible. It's below the surface. It's a product of unequal systems in society, legal instruments, economic markets, who has access to them, different jobs, who doesn't, who has different resources that come out of a system, who doesn't, different security conditions that are available to people, different access to justice mechanisms. It might be laws and how they discriminate against different groups, whether farmers can practice customary land rights or whether they can't, whether children can learn in their mother tongue or whether they can't, or whether they're disadvantaged against that. These systems can privilege or marginalize different groups in society. Might marginalize groups based on their social class, based on gender, based on language or ethnicity, based on religious identification. And it's not always intentional for the various people and various organizations involved in setting up that system that it is going to marginalize. That didn't necessarily, sometimes they did, but they didn't necessarily set out with that intention, but it's an emergent property of that system that it just doesn't work for everybody. Now, why is it structurally violent? Well, according to the definition, it's because it denies the capacity for some groups to meet their basic needs, and it privileges other groups. So another example might be who can rise to a senior position in the military, and does ethnicity or gender play any role in that? Now, if you look right across all of these systems, you can actually measure structural violence in societies. And a really clear example of that happened in many countries during COVID. Because do you recall that they were measuring excess deaths in society? So they were starting to look at how many more people died that year, and then they could attribute the impact that COVID had, right? Even if it wasn't just the number of people that died in hospital, well, how many extra people died overall, and how can we then measure that COVID impact, right? And when those numbers were broken down into different social groups in society, you really saw structural violence quite clearly. So in the United States, for example, structural violence is historically highly evident in race relations in that country. And during COVID, the people that died disproportionately were African American, Hispanic, and not Caucasian or white Americans. And it's intersectional, right? By intersectional, I mean there's other factors that matter rather than just that identity group, like your socioeconomic background, your level of education, your access to resources. But the point is that these systems that we have don't look after people in the same way. It creates structural violence in the sense that some groups are more likely to actually die younger, more likely to experience crime, or more likely, in that example, to not have access to healthcare. The third type of violence, which again I think is really important in Myanmar, is cultural violence. And cultural violence is defined as the underlying ideology or symbolism of our culture that enables our institutions to be structurally violent, that enables or legitimizes direct violence to be taken against some groups. So there's usually an ideological basis, a symbolic basis for making this quote unquote okay to exercise power in this way. And sometimes the cultural cues are coming from religious teaching. So I remember quite strongly around about 2014 when U Wirathu and other Buddhist monks in Myanmar, and there will have been many more in the years since, were quite openly preaching about the threat that Islamic people posed to Buddhism in Myanmar, and were advocating marginalization, the 969 movement, against Islamic businesses, and in some cases were advocating for direct violence against Islamic people, stoking fears around population takeover. And you can see that kind of sermonizing, that kind of legitimation coming through the culture, legitimizing structural violence in the forms of denial of citizenship and access to services and rights for Rohingya people and Islamic people more broadly, and legitimizing direct violence against people. But it happens in less obvious forms than that in Myanmar also. The Burmanization policy for a number of decades, which was attempting to unify the country around Burmese language, Burmese culture, but doing so by excluding the history, language, and culture of other groups in the country. It's a form of cultural violence that legitimates discriminatory policies of state institutions and social institutions. So there's a lot to take in there. This might be the last time that we have a pause like this, but it's an important series of ideas: direct violence, structural violence, and cultural violence. So I wanted to invite you again to pause the recording and to think, particularly with respect to structural violence and cultural violence, what examples have you interacted with in your own life where you feel either privileged by, that's the other side of it, or marginalized by systems in your country that impose limitations or give you advantages because of who you are, because of your identity and group affiliation. And for cultural violence, think about where the legitimation of those systems was coming from. Where are the cultural and ideological framings or cues or ideas that are enabling that to be that way? You might think back to also, if it's not Burmanization policies, censorship and a different information environment pre-2012, or very importantly, I think, the education system. How were you raised to view other groups? How were you raised to understand the language, customary practices, political ideologies, resistance movements of different groups in the country, or how were those histories excluded? How did the three causes and the ideology of the Tatmadaw, how does that shape how group relations were understood? A lot to think about there. Please take a moment and just feel free to take any notes or questions that you might have. Okay, so we are coming to the end of this lecture. There is one more topic, which again, I feel is a very important one with respect to expressions of power related to violence in particular. This is a relatively new idea of power under. Now, power under refers to what people growing up under conditions of repression internalize, and how they learn practices of domination, power over practices, manipulation, practices that helped them to rise up and survive in a difficult environment, but become maladaptive or problematic when they assume leadership positions themselves, because they're not learned how to cooperate very well, how to empathize with others, how to empower others, how to see others succeed without feeling bad themselves, how to be completely honest and vulnerable. And ultimately, these are the attributes of effective cooperation. And this power under idea is really problematic because it's how the patterns of domination in our society, of hierarchical control, of pushing others down so that we can feel good about ourselves, and not being able to dialogue and cooperate really effectively. This is how these patterns continue. And I think if we were to analyze leaders in various organizations in Myanmar and the whole structure of organizations, whether they're political parties, faith-based organizations, NGOs, often you will find dominating forms of leadership, authoritarianism, that are unintentional, but they've been learned because the leaders have come up through those conditions, and that's how they know how to lead. And it holds back unity, it holds back cooperation, and ultimately it holds back the power with strategies that I think we're going to need to change in pursuit of things like federalism and democracy. We'll talk more about that. So I'm going to make the final pivot now from talking about power and structural violence to talking about how we transform it. And I'm going to just introduce the last concepts around how power is exercised in more useful ways with respect to creating a more just and peaceful society. So, remember, we already talked about power over and power under as ways that power is expressed between people. The next one in this category is power to. And this is similar to the idea of agency, which I'm talking about, which is our capacity to act, or our capacity to act in accordance with one's interests. It's relatively easy to understand because that's what we're doing now. We're learning new knowledge. Sometimes we're learning new skills. These give us more capacity to do things in the world. It's not always positive. People doing bad things also increase their power too. But from a perspective of the type of change we're interested to create, this is a useful strategy to develop our capacities. One it's critical, and it's a key feature of the resistance. It's a key challenge with between political parties, EROs, PDFs, NUG, NUCC, and all the other actors, CDM. How do we establish real power with? I think there's been a lot of successes in the last year in forming collaborative relationships, collective agency, because that's what this power with is. It's about how do we work with each other in relationships and through networks towards common goals in ways that individually we might be small and not that powerful, but together we can build a collective power which in total can counteract, defeat, or transform, override this power over challenge that we have, where there's a brutal regime that militarily, economically, ideologically has been exercising power over most of the population for so long. How do we build our power with so that we can finally defeat that? And it's based upon forming collective understandings. It's based upon our capacity to empathize with each other, to compromise, to negotiate, to plan and take shared actions. And I think, as we've seen since the coup, there's still real impediments to do that. When we do the next lecture next week, we're going to get much more specific around the strategies that we might use for power with. But for now, we just want to understand what the concept means. The next one that I want to talk about is the final one, and it's power within. So you remember we talked about invisible power, right? What we are unconscious of, what we think of ourselves and how that has been shaped. This is kind of the flip side of it, right? So power within is our sense of confidence and our dignity and what we think that we're actually capable of doing. So often when we're doing participatory action research, for example, some of you might have taken that class already, in which the people that are doing the research are the actual communities that are wanting to create the change, whether that's grassroots communities, civil society organizations at another level. It's not an outsider researching them, they're researching themselves, right? And one of the ideas of that is that they gain new knowledge, which is empowering and gives them a greater sense of confidence to take their own actions to create change in the world. And it might challenge some of the assumptions of invisible power that they have. Like, I can't do this because I'm a minority. I can't do this because I'm a young person. I can't do this because I'm a woman. So power within strategy is to grow people's sense of confidence and to enable them to take effective actions for themselves. Okay, so I'm just summarizing these expressions of power, because if you remember nothing else from this lecture, I want you to remember this, is that we've looked at power over as a mostly negative form of, or way in which power is exercised to dominate and control. This, I would contend, is a central feature of Myanmar's problem: the use of structural and direct violence and cultural violence as power over a small group dominating many other groups inside the country. It contributes to power under, this internalized sense of how to exercise power as a leader, which is pathological with respect to actually having empathy and collaboration and unity between people. And that's what we need, right? Power with. We need power with. So larger networks of organizations and people that are able to put aside differences and take collective actions in a way that builds a collective power to overthrow a despotic regime. We can contribute to that with a greater sense of power within, internal understandings of ourselves that see ourselves as more capable and more possible, and reject the conditioning that came through our education system, that came from all the ways that we learned in our families and elsewhere that we weren't good enough or not capable. And power two, practical means of acquiring knowledge and skills that enable us individually or collectively to do more. The last point that I'm going to make, the last concept to share with you, is that different levels of social organization in which all of this happens. So in which we are learned and conditioned in ways that shape what we can and can't do. Also in which different levels at which we might take action to affect decision-making. And in this depiction, it's called the Power Cube, by John Gaventa, who's an academic at the Institute where I am. You can read all of his resources on the Power Cube, which help to kind of summarize all the different things that we've talked about. But in relation to levels, he has global, national, and local. And you might think about your advocacy strategies to affect power holders at each one of those different levels. I included household here, and you could also include your own organizations, because these are not just the places where you try to create change, but they're the places where your understanding of power relations, your understanding of yourself is internalized. And the household is a very important one. And I focus on this because I think often in our discussions, we're thinking about spaces that are way beyond our reach and direct access, and we're not always thinking about where we are exercising power or being subject to it in our own lives. And if we want to change the world with respect to justice and transforming violent relationships, then a good place to start is in our own social relationships, in our homes, in our own communities, and showing up differently with respect to how we exercise power, how we treat others, how we see our own capability and take action. So really that idea is at the heart of what we're learning at the moment. Thank you very much for your attention. I know it's been a lot to try to consume over the last hour or so. So just a quick recap of what we have done. We talked about how the definition of power has evolved and come to look at less visible, more subtle and pervasive forms of power. And we made this distinction between power as a multitude of force relations, multitude of factors that influence the agency of particular people or organizations to act in the world. So we are shaped and held in place by power as a field of factors. We talked about various sources that it comes from, some that are obvious, some are less obvious around human bodies, relational networks, and knowledge. We talked about different forms, the visible forms in politics and decision making, the hidden forms, setting the agenda behind the scenes in ways that are not public, not transparent. We talked about invisible power that people are not even conscious of. So it might be ideological or propaganda systems, but it's impacting on people to affect what they think that they are capable of. We spend a lot of time talking about how power is expressed in mostly negative ways that we want to try and change, like power over and power under, through other ways of expressing or exercising power that are constructive and collaborative, like power within, building that, power to do, or power with, the ability or the power that's built by acting collaboratively. We related all of these to trying to change violent socio-political relationships in Burma, and we looked at direct violence, which we can see, and which is acted by one actor against others, and then structural violence, which is not a specific person that is acting that out, but whole systems that marginalize and privilege some groups over others and are legitimated by a cultural or ideological system that makes it okay for those systems to function in those ways. For the readings and for next week, we're going to have a live session, which I'm really looking forward to. Please come prepared. Then we're going to follow up with a much less theoretical and more practical session, which looks at particular strategies for trying to change power relations in positive ways. There are a couple of readings. One is just to reinforce some of the concepts that you've been learning in the All About Power reading, as well as Johan Galtung's violence theories. Then there's one short article written by Aung San Suu Kyi in 1997, in which she was under house arrest at the time, and she made this famous quote, "Please use your liberty to support ours." And I posed some questions for you about whether, when she returned to politics, did she use her liberty to support yours? And by yours, I mean the different groups in Myanmar. And what does that tell us about power relations and some of the concepts that we've learned? So you should have received these questions. So you'll be able to write a couple of pages on that article and also on the ideas of violence that we have learned about. And I also want you to please take some notes from the pauses that you've made during this lecture and come ready in our question and answer session to talk about those. If you have any direct questions or comments for me, you're welcome to leave them in this PowerPoint that you have access to, or also email me. I believe that someone from our CSD will give you my email address if you'd like to do that. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to seeing you next week.